Okay, we're back. We're live. We're ThinkTech, doing a ThinkTech Talks with Mark Duda, the principal everything at RevoluSun LLC, which is one of the biggest, actually, local PV installers in the state. Am I right about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Mark has been in it really a long time. He doesn't look that old, but actually, if you measure him by the number of installations, he's quite old.
Anybody in solar is aging faster than a normal process.
And we're going to call this the evolution of RevoluSun, pardon me. And I guess the first thing I want to mention is the program. Mark is going to be on our panel next Thursday, that is the 26th of September, along with Joe Saturnia, who was just here from Island Pacific Energy, but also Senator Mike Gabbard going to make opening remarks. Cully Judd is going to make opening remarks from Inter-Island Solar. Leslie Cole Brooks, your successor? No, you're I wouldn't say successor, but she's part of the Hawaii Solar Energy Association. You were running that for a long time.
That's right.
Mike Shamply, one of the commissioners on the PUC, Scott Sue, Vice President at HECO, Riley Saito, a competitor, I guess.
I wouldn't say. I mean,
Okay.
We've actually collaborated much more than we used to compete in 2008, and he's
Okay.
moved on.
Everything has changed.
Yeah.
We have SunPower, which is a mainland company. Yeah?
Sure.
And Marco Mangelsdorf from Hilo, and Provision Solar. So, I mean, this is quite a group, and I'm really happy you're part of that panel because you've been around so long and you have such a refined knowledge of the subject. I'm always amazed at how much you teach me every time we sit down together, and I appreciate that. So, talk to me about how you think that panel is going to go. Yeah, the operative question is, what is the industry going to look like in the long term, from now till whenever?
Yeah, I think that it's a tricky question in a couple of different ways. One, of course, it's hard to see the future in general. The second challenge is you're trying to see the future of a whole industry from Hawaii and then figure out how that kind of ramifies back on Hawaii. And that's frankly very tricky. And then all those participants have a different perspective in the industry in terms of how long they've been in it and kind of where they sit. So I think it'll be really interesting in that sense. In terms of what actually is going to happen, I really think you'll hear a lot of different opinions, and probably it'd be easier to get people to agree on what it's going to be like, 20 years from now than 2 years from now, and probably 15 than 5, that kind of thing. So that's probably how it'll kind of go.
How about the really short-term things? Do you think there'll be discussion, including your own, of tax credit questions, undoubtedly, being considered for action next legislative session?
Yeah, I think that will come up, but I've been saying for a couple of years that the tax credit is important, but ultimately in historical context it'll be viewed as a sideshow to the issue of interconnection. And we're starting to see that more and more across all 4 of the state's utilities. It's just very, very challenging to get projects interconnected anymore. And so, I don't relish another session at the legislature trying to figure out this tax credit thing when we've kind of had it done for the last 2 years and failed at the finish line. So that's exhausting and demoralizing, but nonetheless, I'm really much, and I don't know that there's an opinion yet on how that's going to go this year, but I think that the more important discussion is around interconnection.
Yeah, I've heard that from other people too, and I've heard that, maybe there's not the same level of concern about the credits as they used to be. Let's move on from that. It's too much trouble.
Well, again, that's one of those things that varies depending on where you sit in the industry. I mean, there's people that have been working on projects for 4 or 5 years, utility scale projects, that suddenly saw the return on those projects eviscerated by the administrative rules.
Well, the tax office rules last year.
Yeah, exactly. And so, not doing anything about it legislatively continues to harm them. Obviously, the residential customers, on average probably lost about 40% of the state tax credits overnight. It's incredibly disruptive to the solar industry participants, the companies that are trying to manage cash flow and this type of thing, when you essentially sort of screw up the first half of 2013 and although in different directions, the last part of 2012. So it's just been really difficult to operate a business in this context.
You've seen Marco Mangelsdorf's articles and analyses of the numbers of installations and who's been getting, the permits and all this. They suggest that that 2012 was the high water mark. 2013 is not as good, and who's to say what happens in 2014? And I just wonder, whether the tax office rules have some effect on that, or the demoralization you talk about.
Marco says a lot of things, and many of them are pretty nuanced, and I think I disagree with a lot of it. But so I don't want to be cast as sort of agreeing to everything that he's writing. But on the top line issue of did the industry peak in 2012, I absolutely think so. It's a function of a lot of different things. One is just there's a bunch of stuff that would have gone in 2013 and 2014 that went in 2012 as a result of basically pre-announcing to the world, hey, we're going to cut the state credit next year, which translates to if you were ever thinking of doing a PV system or solar system anytime in the future, make sure you do it by the end of 2012.
So they had 60 days, everybody ran to do it in 60
exactly.
days.
And so for one thing, you dragged a bunch of the future into 2012. 2012 was also the last year that you had smooth sailing on interconnection for HECO, which is still where the majority of the state's utility customers are. And HELCO was in better shape interconnection-wise, and KAC was in 2012 as well. NECO was sort of already at the point where it had become challenging, not impossible, but there were delays there. But I mean, we're literally seeing places on the HELCO system where I don't want to say you can't interconnect, but where the proposition back to a homeowner looks like, well, if you pay us $10,000, we're going to do this study, but don't get your hopes up even then, because you might have to spend a bunch more money or might not be able to say yes. And so it's the type of letter that is discouraging to a homeowner who's considering doing PV. That's not every circuit, but it's more common. So, that's the direction that we're moving in. And so the question is, what follows that? And that's really going to determine what that path looks like over the next 2, 5, 10, 15 years. But maybe not 15, because at a certain point we'll just be buying batteries and taking people off grid. And so really this is ultimately a question about what happens between now and then, and who will survive and that kind of thing.
But very interesting. You talk about batteries, because batteries, and Joe Saturni was in here talking about his EM Power product, which is a sort of smaller, lighter, maybe cheaper battery installation that could handle any kind of clean energy, and keep it going overnight when the power is not firm and so forth. And from the interconnect issue that you raised, I mean, I'm sure that will be raised at the program next week. It's a lot of that is about the need to stay connected, right? And if you have a battery that works, maybe this changes the formula somehow.
Well, it absolutely does. I gave a talk at the Hawaii Economic Development Board meeting, which was called something like After Oil or Beyond Oil, and from an electric power perspective. And my fundamental point was that the alternative to grid-tied PV is not the utility, it's off-grid PV. And every year, every cost reduction, every technological improvement, we get closer and closer to the world in which to that world. And so, rather than sort of trying to make it more difficult to connect to the grid or to raise the cost of being a grid-tied PV customer, I think utilities should be looking at ways to keep these people on rather than driving them off, because it's not a one-off event. Like once the cost of batteries hits this price point, it's all over. It's a continuum. And so, depending on what your utility rates are and what the cost of what the return is for being a net metered or grid-tied utility customer, whether you're charged extra, all this type of stuff, it just goes into a return calculation, and people are situated at various points along that return continuum, and they're just going to start between the money and the money and the money and the money over time for people to get off the grid. And the challenge from a public policy perspective is who's left once that process is fully underway. You're going to have, if you think of this island, you'll have downtown and Waikiki and people that are renting in high-rise environments and condos. You know,
Everybody else will be on PV all by themselves.
that's right. And outside the regulatory scope, outside the utilities' ability to influence things as well. It's just, you know,
It's in the
like I say,
process.
we're heading there. And it may not be batteries, it could be some other sort of firm power or you know, time shifting device. But that's the future. It's just a matter of when we get there.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I want to, you know, the thing about it is that you have been involved, my observation, in the high policy points of PV from the beginning, from the time you first got involved in it. And there haven't been all that many people who are capable of appreciating it the way you have. And it just strikes me that, you know, at first, I think everybody saw PV as a luxury for a few people. They saw PV as an almost experimental kind of technology that not everybody, you know, would or should or could take advantage of. That didn't have that much effect on the grid. That didn't have that much effect on the way things worked in the average household. It was an extravagance of sorts. All that's changed now. And now it has a huge public policy effect now and going forward. More than any other renewable, it is going to change the way things work. That's what I think.
Yep, I totally agree. It is going to be the thing that changes everything. You know, that period when it was sort of the very well, it was a high cost product for wealthy early adopters. I think that kind of ended around 2008. 2008 was when we saw the price of oil go up to 140 bucks a barrel or whatever it was. And it just became cost competitive even at the installed cost for PV at that time for middle income people with decent credit and you know the ability to borrow already at that point. But it's definitely the case that as the price has come down of PV, you know, it's become more and more of a moderate income phenomenon. And that's sort of one of the ironies is that, you know, now all these efforts to sort of limit people's ability to connect to the grid are being justified on the basis of like equity issues, when really there's an equity issue in keeping the sort of like moderate income people who are getting PV now out when there were wealthier people in the you know early days that went in. I mean, I guess like the early adopter phase of any technology, I don't expect that a Tesla will cost you know whatever it is, 100 grand,
true.
you know, 5 years from
It's
now.
got to change, right? The old rule, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, exactly. So that's what's happening, and we're now like purely in the middle market stage of this thing, and so we've crossed the valley of death from the early adopters, and it's you know the demand is there. The demand is almost unlimited. It's too strong, but the demand is tremendous, and we're just talking about the rules under which this stuff is allowed to interconnect to the grid.
Well, I think it's two factors which you know I'd really like to dwell on. One is the factor of the financing arrangements that are available now. I mean, they were not even conceived back in, say, 2008. You wrote a check, and I mean, a few banks might have been approachable about this, but now they all are. And now the you know there's all these guys. I'm sure RevoluSun must be doing this too. You know, of owning it and selling monthly subscription essentially for the installation on your roof. And then I don't know what's going to happen exactly, but the PUC is supposed to breathe life into the on-bill financing thing in January. Well, that's going to, these things have got to have a huge effect on PV, all of them.
They definitely do. I mean, you know, who would have a $40,000 car if you had to buy it in cash, right? I mean, some people, but not as many people as would have it if you could get it financed and pay for it monthly, and the same with a house, right? So, you know, PV has sort of benefited from that sort of increasing sophistication and evolution of the financing. The interesting story in Hawaii is actually not the leasing, which I think is what you were describing, where a third party will buy the system and then essentially sell power at less than what the utility charges to them monthly. What I think is more interesting is the fact that the Hawaii banks have sort of showed up not on day one, but eventually to do this kind of lending. And you don't find that really in any meaningful way in any other PV market in the country. And I think this has to do with the fact that Hawaii is a unique banking market. I mean, we're not banked by the B of A's and Citi and Wells and those kind of guys. So, those entities are developing PV-oriented loan products, and they're going to roll those things out sometime in the next year. And the rest of the country is going to start looking more like Hawaii does in that sense, which I think means a reversal of market share from leasing back to, you know, cash, but it'll be cash from the contractor's perspective that people secure by getting either getting a secured or unsecured PV loan. So that's we're absolutely ahead of the curve as far as that goes, and it's because it's just such a mass phenomenon here at PV. You can't have this opportunity to lend and then just turn your back on it if you're a lender here.
You know, you offered the thought that those banks are getting into it because Hawaii is a fairly sophisticated real estate market where the banks know very well how to secure their loans against real estate. I'm not sure, maybe you know more about this, but I would imagine that a bank who would loan you money for a PV installation is going to take paper on your house. It's that simple.
It's both. There's secured and unsecured. And so you can, I forget the specifics, but roughly those programs are, you can get $35,000 to $50,000 unsecured. You have to have a decent credit score or a solid debt to income ratio, that kind of stuff.
Do they own the unit though? Do they have a financing statement against the unit?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
Completely unsecured? Wow,
Yeah.
that's
Because
something.
these things, I think, are ultimately personal property anyway.
Yeah.
It's like a fixture as opposed to a
You
real
can
property.
secure that with it. Anyway, okay, so then we'll come back and we'll talk more about how on-bill financing might affect all of that. We're going to have a break now. I guess you could get the message. That's Mark Duda. He's with RevoluSun. We're talking about the evolution of RevoluSun here on ThinkTech Talks on a given Monday. We'll be right back after this break. Aloha, this is Jay Fidell. You know, ThinkTech and the Hawaii Venture Capital Association put on monthly luncheon panel programs at the Plaza Club here in Pioneer Plaza. Our program this time is on September 26th. It's called Solar in Hawaii. We're going to examine the solar industry and see what's in it for the long haul. We have a great panel, great moderator. We'll be sending out email on this. If you want to be in our email list to receive the details, check out thinktechhawaii.com. In any event, you can sign up for the program at hvca.org. Thanks. See you there. This is Jay Fidell. Mahalo. Okay, we're back. We're live. We're at ThinkTech doing ThinkTech Talks with Mark Duda of RevoluSun. And we're talking about the evolution of RevoluSun here on ThinkTech Talks. And so before the break, the cliffhanger was how is on-bill financing going to affect, the new availability of bank arrangements to secure PV. What do you know about it, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think the key promise from a residential PV perspective is the opportunity to get into the sort of portfolio of renters. If you think about what's going on, we have a lot of rented single-family detached housing in Hawaii, and those generally, from a kind of a technical perspective, are good candidates for PV. There's an opportunity for somebody to save money, but it typically isn't the somebody who owns the house. And so, to put it in its simplest terms, a renter is not going to buy a PV system and give it to the landlord, and the landlord typically doesn't want to buy a PV system merely to lower the tenant's electric bill. So you have this kind of economic mismatch. And so, I think the key promise of the on-bill financing is that you can get into that renter portfolio, and the rules are designed so that it'll give comfort to the landlords in that situation. So hopefully that will expand the market somewhat.
What's in it for the landlord, though? Does he got a slice of the pie somehow?
Well, I think that would be up to the landlord. I mean, you can do any number of things. I mean, just in a simple example, if the rent is $1,000 a month and the utility bill is $100 a month, then currently the tenant is probably paying the utility the $100 and the landlord the $1,000. If the landlord buys a PV system and that bill, and takes over that bill, they could charge the tenant $1,100 or $1,200,
or make a spread on it,
or whatever, however it is. So I mean, I don't think the goal here is to give landlords an opportunity to surreptitiously charge their tenants more, but there should be some savings generated here, and those could probably be split between the landlord and the tenant. So
yeah,
I think that's it. But I don't think it's going to make every single landlord jump up and buy a PV system for their rental property, but ultimately there'll be some.
They have to give it the nod. They have to say okay. I mean, because it's their roof.
Exactly.
And they don't have to permit anything on their roof, whether the tenant likes it or not.
Right.
The other thing was that there was a bill passed last year that let the landlord effectively put it on his roof and resell to a condominium, which I thought was a pretty positive bill. I mean, and it brought, as you said, a whole new cohort of customers into the ball game.
Yeah, I try to think of the market as a sort of a rectangle or square, like a matrix, right? And so you could have, residential owner occupied. The market works there. Residential renter occupied doesn't work so well. And whether or not these things exist as a function of the what the contractors are willing to do, what the financing is willing to do, and also the sort of regulatory issues and everything else. And so the bill that you're referring to addressed one of those regulatory issues, which was it was unclear whether if you have let's just think of it in a commercial context, it's a little simpler, a shopping center with 4 tenants, build one big PV system and sub-meter all of the tenants and figure out how much power you're selling to all of them. It was possible or was ambiguous as to whether or not in that scenario in the past you would be regulated as a public utility because you're selling power to the general public and or you're not.
And that is not something you want hanging around
it's
your,
just not
company.
Worth it.
Yeah.
So that bill clarified that in that scenario you weren't, and it also prohibited you from selling it at more than the current retail rate and that kind of thing. So it sort of gamed things toward there being some benefit for the tenant.
Have any projects actually done it yet?
I'm not aware of any. It's still, somewhat of a complicated area, and in a lot of cases, you're talking about places that the landlords have found a way, even under the existing rules, to do something. Like we have some systems on shopping centers that we placed in service maybe a year ago. They're feed-in tariff projects, so that the landlord is just, essentially using the roof for some economic purpose. They're selling power to the utility, and they're renting out the inside to these different
It really
tenants.
has nothing to do with the tenants then.
In
You're
that
just
case,
making a profit center of the roof. I love that.
That's right. And, I think they would probably rather, all else equal, sell power to the tenants, and they might even be able to get more than the feed-in tariff rate, because there's definitely a spread between the feed-in tariff rate and the retail rate. But, then you've got to convince the tenants to do it, and then you're tied up renegotiating that thing if the tenants switch out. So I think it's just like, okay, assuming you can get that project built and interconnected, then you're just collecting your checks for 20 years and maintaining the system instead of talking to tenants about it.
I remember you were involved in a shopping center in Kona, I think it was. We talked about this a long time ago, and I was so impressed at how you managed to install the PV in such a way so that you could handle all of the regulatory issues.
Yeah, that would be a system that would be built differently under this new law, because what it really was a series of systems, each of which fed a single tenant meter rather than a larger pooled project.
Yeah, so it's better to have a pooled project.
I think so.
Well, but I wanted to get into that very idea, namely that in the future, going forward, the shopping center, if it disconnected and from the grid, and just did its own thing, because shopping centers have big roofs by definition, right? Then everything would work swell, and why be connected? Why would a shopping center that had the battery installation, that had efficient, newer PV cells, why would it want to be connected? Isn't it the future? Aren't we going to find that distributed energy is all around PV, and PV is all around being off the grid?
Well, I think so, and the way you phrase that question is the way that I think that utilities need to be asking themselves now. Like why would my customer remain my customer if they had this other option? And so, for the most part, we're not, predominantly in the world where they do have that other option, but it's clearly coming. And so, exactly, what would make you stay connected? And, not to call anybody out, but utilities don't have the best reputation for customer service. They don't have, this kind of thing. So it's not like people are going to stay out of some kind of loyalty. It really boils down to economics, and in my experience. And when the economics change, I think the transition is going to be very, very quick. There's some technology risk there that they're clearly going to worry about. Will these batteries really function? What if the load grows? Can I still manage it? This kind of stuff. But I mean, it's just going to be a very practical set of concerns that drive that decision from the customer's perspective. Because I don't think there's any sort of non-pecuniary factors that are going to keep them tied in there.
Taking all of that together. Mm-hmm. And recognizing going forward, it's not as if the PUC was unaware of this issue. It's not as if, the industry was unaware of this issue, or that the utility was unaware of this issue. But you mentioned that the utility should be taking steps to remain in the picture. to remain connected, to continue to provide a service for everybody who might consider the other a disconnected option. How do you do that? What advice would you give them?
Well, just to be clear, my point is I think that's their business model challenge going forward as
sure.
these things change. And I honestly don't know what the solution is. I mean, the core of a solution would be to find a way to be either useful or necessary. And we've lived through a long period in which they've been necessary. When they're not necessary anymore, what value can they offer? And I've heard people talk about they would sort of be effectively this exchange where what their model would be to encourage as many different power producers to compete on price with one another, not with the utility, and then you may be procuring power from so and you can and then someone else can get it cheaper, so you'd have this really sort of robust kind of market, and then they would be sort of like the stock exchange, only it's the grid, the wires that do this. I don't know that there's any precedent for that exact model yet, although there's situations where they've gone partway down it, and you do have the transmission and distribution separated from the generation and that kind of stuff. But that's different from saying our goal explicitly is to develop, like I say, this marketplace where power can be exchanged at the and at the most competitive rates possible, and we're going to make money off of being that exchange. So it's things, and again, I don't know the answer, but it's things like that, not okay, let's figure out the optimal mix of wind and solar and fossil, and then let's dial in this and then kind of lock it down, which has traditionally been more the way that they've operated.
But if this happens, if we go to a sort of an exchange, a free market, if you will, of a power coming and going, which we have the ability to technologically to do that, and more all the time. Exactly what do they become? And what is the regulation? Because it seems to me you don't need so much regulation there. Well, you just let the market handle it.
Yeah, I think they would need to be regulated based on the cost they charged for providing this exchange kind of service. They or someone else may be what the sort of provider of last resort, and so that means you have a bunch of capital investment that you use infrequently. So you have to figure out how to get people compensated for that, and at the level where they'll actually do it. And those kind of things, but they need to figure out how to make money off of things that the world wants. Once we get to a scenario where the world doesn't need to be grid tied in order to make its own power, in a lot of cases, like I say, I don't see us replacing Waikiki's power with something else. But you never know.
You never know. I mean, they got roofs too.
Yeah.
And cells get more efficient. Maybe those roofs will be sufficient, in square footage. Well, and I wanted to complicate it by asking you another question, which I will ask you, and then we'll take a break so you can think about it, okay? We got the undersea cable issue. We got wind on Maui, and Maui wants to sell wind to Oahu. We got geothermal sitting, not fully developed, but a lot of people interested in developing it in the Big Island. We have these large installations which are not really distributed at all, and we have the possibility of solar farms, where the solar farm is really sort of a generating system that needs to be transmitted elsewhere. And we have the utility, which has transmission lines still and will, and then we have the possibility of additional transmission lines undersea. So I wanted to ask you, after we get back from the break, and if you want a long break on this, we'll do that. Yeah. I want to ask you how that feeds into the distributed notion, of the homeowner getting off, and the utility not having him as a customer and all that. So we'll be right back with this very interesting question that I have propounded. You agree it's an interesting question?
Of course.
Okay, we'll be right back. That's Mark Duda. He can handle it. RevoluSun LLC, ThinkTech Talks, here about the evolution of RevoluSun. We'll be right back.
I'm Bill Spencer, President of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're at ThinkTech. We are so delighted to have Mark Duda here from RevoluSun LLC in a ThinkTech talk about the evolution of RevoluSun. Okay, and the cliffhanger question, which he probably hasn't had a whole lot of time because I was occupying the conversation during the break, is how does the whole thing about the undersea cable and large installations of geothermal or wind, or for that matter PV farms, play in the distributed or not distributed future of Hawaii power?
Okay. I think the way to think about this is that the regulatory environment has a pretty surprising ability to influence the relative cost of power from these different technologies, and to the extent that that's actually been the primary driving force of what got built and interconnected and used to generate power in the state in the past. But we're coming to a period when that isn't the case, as we've been talking about, with the ability of people to go fully off-grid and that type of thing. And so, in that environment, then what's going to happen is that those costs will play a much stronger role in driving what actually gets built and used to generate power in the state. And so, just to fully make something up, if suddenly you could do enough geothermal power for the entire state at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, then I think you wouldn't see a lot of grid-tied or off-grid PV, because it would have such a tremendous impact on the overall cost of power that it would make the thing that's probably the most cost competitive right now not ultimately cost competitive. And so all of those changes or all of those sort of prices are going to get associated with these different technologies at different scales. And then, when you have the option sitting out there of not being grid tied, then we're really going to have a period where these things get focused in on and clarified in a ways that those price signals have been attenuated by the regulatory process and all these other goals besides simply cost that we've been optimizing over for the last however long. So, when you talk about a technology that requires capital investment at this level, including the cost of transmitting it to market, then that's how it's going to get looked at, and just as distributed PV and other distributed technologies will get looked at. So I think that is going to be the primary change, and the thing that drives the answer to the question that you asked is getting away from these kind of cloudy price signals to less cloudy price signals. I mean, notably less cloudy, although not pure or imperfect.
But I'll give you a thought, and tell me where it fits. If you go by price alone, then you'll do LNG. I mean, strictly speaking, if you go by price alone, you could nuclear. Nuclear is really cheap, and I don't think that people in Hawaii are still, even after all these 5 years of talk. I don't think they're all that sophisticated about the notion that if you build a new system, if you have a transformation to clean energy, you've got to put new equipment in. Somebody has to pay for that. And there's been talk about, just have the utility pay for it. It's not that simple. The utility hasn't got the money to pay for that. We have to pay for it. We have to find a way. And so to say, we're not going to pay for new stuff, and we're only going to go for cost, seems to be, in my view, a little on the short-sighted basis, because a few years down the road, we need a working system that deals with things that are more important than interim cost. Don't you agree?
I think I agree, if I understand what you're saying, which is that we need to focus on some bigger picture issues as we look at the state's energy system. Like, for one thing, there's just this vulnerability issue that we have that, something could happen to us that would make us say, wow, I wish we spent that $5 billion to make our utility grid better, whatever the number is. Certainly we're vulnerable to that type of thing, which could leave us with economic impacts and maybe even human kind of impacts that are devastating. So that needs to be factored in. The other thing is, I don't think we're in a position like a lot of to make a state, maybe like Missouri can wait, like let's let everybody else make mistakes, and in 2030 that's when we'll convert to smart grids and renewable energy. But they have that luxury, and they're not paying what we pay, and they're not as vulnerable to the cost of oil as we are, or supply disruptions like we are. So I think we need some willingness to be wrong. To recognize that we have to go in the first group. We don't have to be first necessarily, but we really should go in the first group. And if 20 years from now there's something that's cheaper, that works a little bit better, that doesn't mean that we made a mistake by converting now to a system that allows us to use as many indigenous energy sources as possible in whatever capacity. I mean, I think that's the baseline. And if we don't kind of look at it from that perspective, we just say, okay, well, we got to wait a little bit longer, and then this, and we'll still keep going. I just feel like we're going to get caught out at some point in this process. Like the music is going to stop before we find our chair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well put. Yeah. So this is troublesome, because we could make big mistakes here, one way or the other, and we could wind up with a system that is behind the curve, and we could lose the benefit of these enormous resources we know we have.
Yep.
So it comes down to we're talking during the break about how we've had all this talk, but not a whole lot of pointed action. Organized action with may I use the word plan?
Yeah.
And I don't mean just a mixed plan. I mean a big plan about step 1, step 2, step 3, how you get to where you need to go. And of course, in their defense, I would say to the people who argue that we don't need a plan, as well, it's hard to make a plan with a moving target. And that's what we got.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of political benefits in being the person with the plan either, because it's not all good news, and you could be wrong, and you'll be excoriated for being wrong. I feel like it really isn't easy to come up with a plan, and I would imagine that anybody in a position of potential leadership on this hears, among other things, exactly opposing views on what the plan should be. So you need to come with that expertise, or be able to develop trust in your ability to kind of see the future, which, as we talked about earlier, isn't that easy to do in this area where you're not an expert, and then stake all your political capital on doing this. And it's really take a tremendous, almost an anomaly in terms of the way politics work, and a bunch of political courage on top of that, and then a plan not only for where you're going to go, but a plan for staying the course, which would be very, very difficult. So from that perspective, I'm kind of pessimistic that the political process, the way it works, will end up putting us on a path where we get a plan like that. But I totally agree with you that that's where we are, is we need something like that, and we need to articulate all of the assumptions, like this is where we should go for all of these reasons. We shouldn't do this or that, and this plan is based on this and this and this. And if these things change, we're going to have to look at the plan again. We don't think they will, but they could, and if they do, and if these other things change, we're going to keep going. But that would be the way to really do this.
Okay, well, I mean, we could talk all day just about that. But let me ask you, how do you develop the political will? I mean, who is the leader on this? Is it the governor? Should it be the governor? Should it be the PUC? Should it be the legislature? Should it be industry? I don't know. Should it be trade groups? Who should it be?
Well, I think so far all of the above haven't succeeded.
Right.
So I honestly don't know. I mean, I feel like the movement for cost-effective power is the drive among the citizens of the state for cost-effective power does have the potential for a social movement, because you're hitting a lot of the key aspects of that. It's a cost of living issue. It's non-partisan. I mean, we sell as many systems to people on the right as on the left, and it's not a Democrat or Republican, any of this kind of stuff. So, and there's something in it for labor, and there's something in it for capital in terms of the finance community. It really cuts across all of those things. So there's no inherent downside, but I don't feel like this has been sort of appropriately cultivated and masked to apply political pressure on the elected officials and appointed officials to really do what you said, come up with a plan, stick with it, that kind of thing. So, I'm a little bit pessimistic, but if you ask me where I think this could possibly come from, I think it's got to be bottom up. And then somebody that can kind of appropriately tap that could become the leader of this thing.
The Progress Alliance, the people,
Yep.
the grassroots.
Yeah.
Nobody that we know yet.
Exactly. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, I hope it happens. Gee.
Yep. It would be incredibly exciting.
It would be exciting, but there'd be a huge level of education involved because, I used to think that you could, get on television, do this,
Yeah.
and somehow educate the people so that they would know and that they would form this kind of inchoate kind of progress alliance. But it's hard to train, it's hard to educate them about the very sophisticated things which are always changing.
Well, the other thing is, I think for the average person, when they say, "Why is my power so expensive?" and then they hear people start talking, well, it's the this and the avoided cost and cost for contribution, the lost contribution to fixed cost, and all this type of stuff. They're like, "All right, so you're not going to solve my problem. That's what you're telling me." And so they very legitimately lose interest and lose faith in the process.
Right.
So
And bow out.
Yeah, they bow out, exactly, and like, all right, I guess I'll use less or find a way to make more money to pay the bill. I mean, literally, that's what's going on.
Yeah, I
So
agree
you
with
got
you.
to turn them back on by giving them a path to where something is possible. Where change looks possible to people, and I don't think that it does now.
Yeah. But with all of that, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'd like to ask you about LNG and where LNG fits, because it could be a simple solution, could be a cheap solution, but is it consistent with the general direction of where this state is going? Okay, so that's Mark Duda, RevoluSun LLC. We're talking about the evolution of RevoluSun. We will get to that here on the ThinkTech Talks. I'm Jay Fidell. We'll be right back after this very, very short break.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech.
I'm Maria Kashen. See you next time.
We're back, we're live. We're here with Mark Duda of RevoluSun LLC, talking about the evolution of RevoluSun on ThinkTech Talks. So, Mark, what do you think about LNG? Is there really a chance, and how do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I don't think of myself as an expert on LNG, so when I consider it, I kind of try to line it up and ask the same questions of it that I do of other technologies. As we were talking before, I think all else equal, anything that you have to bring in is worse. I mean, obviously all else isn't equal, but that's sort of a mark against it, right? We need to continue to get it here. We need to have a facility that can accommodate it here if we're going to be tremendously reliant on it. And I think that's an issue with biodiesel that comes from Indonesia as well as with oil or with LNG. So I think that's a concern. We pay more for LNG here than we do other places. I don't know how much that's supposed to change once we, potentially have it here. But I think the biggest reason not to do it would be because it's a little bit like the methadone kind of analogy, right? I mean, we're not on heroin anymore, but
That's very good.
that doesn't mean that we don't have a problem. And it would be different if we didn't have other energy sources. I feel like the push to LNG just puts us in the position of avoiding trying to do the hard work of trying to figure out how we can really run the state off of all of the renewable energy that we're just drowning in here. It's stunning how much renewable energy there is here. And if we made a commitment to say, we're going to tap all of this and start using it, and everything else has to conform to that, from the, the customers who may have to suffer with potentially for a period a little bit less reliable power supply, to the utility with reduced returns, to everything else in between. If we did that, we would actually make it there. And so to me, this LNG thing feels like a detour from where we actually ultimately need to go. And so, from that perspective, I'm concerned. I'm not trying to say it's worse than the situation we have now, but I think it takes us. It moves the detour, away from the point that we ultimately need to get to, anyway, farther out. So I think that's where I think we are on that.
Geothermal?
Geothermal, I don't have any particular background in the sort of cultural sensitivities of it, but it looks like a tremendous resource to me. I mean, it has the potential to be baseload power. I don't think it's always performed as baseload power, the stuff that we've got, but it has that potential, and it's clean, and it's not particularly expensive relative to what we're using now. So, I think it's a great technology, and we should use it to the extent that it makes sense.
I heard something recently on the radio, I think, about how Ormat, the public company that owns not only Puna Geothermal Venture, but a lot of other geothermal ventures around the world, has new technology that is actually sort of a self-contained loop instead of using the steam.
Yep.
And running the steam through the turbines. And so the question is, why not here? And the answer is, well, there's political resistance here. We could be doing so much better at geothermal if we would only finally accept it. On the other hand, you still need to have an undersea cable if you want to share it among the islands.
Yeah, but you could start by just trying to power Big Island.
Yes, that's true.
And see how it goes. Build the cable later.
Yeah, true, you could.
If it turned out to be cost effective and reliable at the level that would justify that, whatever it is, multi-billion-dollar investment to bring the power off of Hawaii Island onto Maui and ultimately on from there.
It raises the interesting question, though, of what happens if we find that geothermal is subject to seismic faults,
Yep.
or is imperfect in some way or another. Can we invest the whole future of the Big Island into that, or should we keep what you were saying, keep all the possibilities under the tent, including possibilities we haven't explored yet, like OTEC, which really we haven't invested enough to make that work. So what's your answer on that?
I just think that we never consider the risk associated with not doing anything. I mean, we're sitting here very, very vulnerable, economically and physically or from an engineering perspective. And so, if you could somehow, objectively and from outside sort of quantify the risk of the current system relative to a geothermal-based system, which has this concern that you're talking about of seismic disruptions, versus another kind of system. And we just need to get down doing the empirical analysis in a non-politicized way, at least to have a baseline. I mean, as I think you made the point earlier, a lot of this debate is going on among the insiders and at the PUC or at the legislature. It's not out there in the popular press so much. So, having good empirical data that's, informs that debate, I think would be really useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like what happened in Syria. Maybe you heard it here on ThinkTech. The comparison between Hawaii Energy and Syria.
I'm going to learn something here.
Well, what Obama did is he went to the public, and the public fed back to Congress.
Yeah.
And the public said no war, and Congress, for the most part, although there are hawks definitely in Congress, the Congress is adopting what the public is telling it. Yeah. And that could happen here too. It could happen about energy. But the public has got to be informed, and it's got to speak back. It's got to participate.
Yeah, something has to trigger its participation. I mean, I don't know how well the public is informed on Syria, but clearly they spoke. So, we're getting a policy direction out of it, as you say.
Yeah.
And I think that would be good on these kind of questions.
Well, let's take a moment and talk about RevoluSun. You were involved really at the beginning of the modern era, the modern energy era, MEE.
Yeah.
You've been through a lot, and you've seen a lot, and you've done well, I think. It looks from across the street, it looks like you've done well. Tell us about RevoluSun.
Sure. Well, as you say, we've kind of ridden this boom that's happened in renewable energy since 2008, and for the most part, the epicenter of that boom has been in solar. It's required a lot of, when you unpack that, it's really been different market segments over time, and not sort of like they're all pretty good and one is great. It's like one turns on and the other one turns off, and this kind of thing. And so, we've sort of tried to stay ahead of, and in some cases chase those different segments. In the early days, we did a lot of rooftop commercial PV. That was kind of the low-hanging fruit, and then the residential, kind of grew up from there, starting really in 2009.
So you started more in commercial then?
Yep. And that was really where the action was, for lack of a better term, at that time. And then, we've been through the feed-in tariff process where we've developed projects, and just sort of, it's been like a 5-year, I guess it is, maybe sprint, just to sort of find something that's working at that particular time, and to kind of move around and try to do a decent job of sort of harvesting what's ripe, in a particular window. And we haven't always been perfectly successful at that, but we've managed to stay ahead enough that we've kind of built a stable company, and built a company that builds PV systems that are going to last for their entire prescribed lifetime, which is not the case.
We don't know
everything.
yet, do we?
We don't, but the goal is to build in a way that these things are going to last. And when you get into a boom kind of mentality, I think that's differentiated us from some of our other competitors, where they're just throwing stuff up and moving on to the next job. So I sort of, in some ways, look forward to the days when our stuff is, the phone's not ringing like the Maytag repairman, and and I think a lot of other guys aren't going to make it as a result of the burden of going back and doing fixing work that's.
There'll be some consolidations, don't you think? And you'll be in an interesting position because you are big. I mean, and I love your office high atop Kapiolani Boulevard with all that creativity in all directions. It's a perfectly creative place, which means, if you're in a new business, a startup business, in a new era, a new industry, you want to be in creativity. You want to figure out things that nobody else can figure out. But it seems to me that when a consolidation happens, and I think I agree with you that it will happen, you'll be in a position of acquiring companies that maybe can't stand the consolidation.
Yeah, I've actually sort of been asked that question over time. Are you looking to buy, or different parts? And for the most part, I don't think that there's a lot of expertise to acquire that's not duplicative with stuff that we've already got. So we'll be looking for market share, but I don't know that we want to buy anybody else. And the other thing is, when you in a construction context, you're inheriting responsibility for all of the permitting and warranty issues and stuff like that. And so without having a real good read on what was done and in what way over time, it sort of makes you, there may be less there than meets the eye in a lot of cases, I guess, is the perspective of an insider kind of looking at that type of acquisition.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a company that did the installation, sold it, got out, maybe has a warranty obligation, but little more than that, an obligation, not an income, an obligation.
Yeah.
What is that worth exactly? They don't have necessarily any IP. Their customer list is spent already. They've done the work.
Yep.
Exactly what's the value there? Maybe the value of their staff, but you can develop your own staff.
Right.
So you're right. It doesn't really make sense in most cases, I think. Reputation, maybe, but
Yeah, I think that's.
if they were to get a good reputation, they wouldn't need to be acquired. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think we agree that from 300 companies now, it's not going to be 300 companies
No,
later.
it definitely won't.
What do you see? How do you see it all?
I really don't know. I wish I could see this more clearly. This question is, what is the appropriate sort of industrial organization of the residential PV industry? And, there's examples in both directions, like there's the, plumbers for the most part are, there's not just like this one giant plumbing company that does every single residential plumbing job in the state, right? There are a lot of little companies, and they're diversified across all different kinds of plumbing stuff, including solar hot water in a lot of cases. So, ultimately that may be the model, and the solar specialty contractor may sort of fade out. I think that's probably a near-term danger for the medium-sized entities. I think the larger ones are probably going to ride through based on market share and know-how and that kind of thing. But it seems to me there's never going to be anything to stop an electrician who's typically doing residential electrical work, wiring up an addition or something else like that. Say, hey, well, I also do PV. Oh, really? Okay.
Sure, let's do business. Yeah.
There's almost no additional overhead associated with being in the PV industry for companies like that. So I don't see how they get pushed out of the market. I mean, if anything, it's going to get simpler.
Sure. You go down to Costco,
yeah,
buy your stuff, call somebody to install it, all finished.
Right. I mean, now you need licensed workers, and you need permits, and all this stuff that's designed to make sure that the workers and the homeowner are protected. But that stuff will get simplified over time as well. And so, like I say, I don't think the need for the specialty is going to continue as strongly.
What about farms? Commercial farm, big farms that yield a lot of electricity.
I think those are pretty cost effective relative to other options. I mean, we suffer here from really expensive real estate. I mean, when people come out here looking for land, they're used to the Western U.S. paying like $200 per acre per year, and they get out here and they hear like $8,000-$10,000. They're like, how is this even possible? I mean, literally, like you can see them not believing you. And so I think that's going to be a constraint, but still the PV itself is really quite inexpensive to develop at that scale. And so, where you find all of the cost coming from is the risk in the interconnection process, the risk from curtailment, the regulatory timelines, just, all of this stuff that could be shortened to, every place where you see a month, you could see a day or two. Every place where you see a bunch of risk, you could eliminate almost all of it, from a regulatory perspective. And if we can do that, you'll really see some inexpensive PV. So I think there'll continue to be a lot of PV in the state at the farm level.
But what's very interesting, with the residential installation and a battery setup, you can go off the grid. So you don't care what the utility does in that case. With a farm, you're not off the grid. You built it so you could be on the grid.
That's right.
So whatever the bureaucratic snafus are, you've got them all.
Yeah, no, the division, the way to think about the division is the distributed generation, the behind the meter versus outside the meter. And so if you're sort of wholesaling power to the utility, you're definitely in a very different bucket than you are if you're offsetting your own load.
Last question.
Okay.
Warranties, maintenance agreements. It's a whole profit center that hasn't been explored. Do you see it coming up? Do you see it coming down the pike?
I hear a lot of talk about that. I think that people will look back on the sort of portfolio of work that was done in the last part of 2012 and the first part of 2013 as like the worst work ever in some ways, because it was done, in a lot of cases, because the January 1st deadline from the tax department was coming up. And so, people were calling anybody, and a lot of contractors said sure, and then just subcontracted it. Literally, people hadn't done it before. And so I just can't believe that stuff was installed well. So I think it's going to fail at a rate that keeps somebody really healthy. But, in terms of how attractive a business like that is, it's a function of how much you can insulate yourself from the risks that were introduced as part of the construction process. And, is the work to code? Is it built to last? What are you taking responsibility for when you go in there and touch it? And so I'm talking about things different than cleaning the panels or that kind of stuff, where you're going and fixing, flawed electrical work and that kind of thing. It's a risky area from a construction liability perspective. It's a really risk-fraught area.
You'd rather build it yourself.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark Duda.
Sure.
Great to have you. Always great, these discussions. I had forgotten, but you're better than ever. Mark Duda, RevoluSun LLC. We got miles to go, but we're going to have to cut it for now. This is a ThinkTech Talk. We're talking about the evolution of RevoluSun. We'll do it again.
All right.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Jay.
Aloha.